when King Jean II had been captured on the field of Poitiers and later died a prisoner in England. The heart of the kingdom seemed to die with him. The Valois crown, once a symbol of dignity and order, now floated without an anchor, and into that vacuum stepped a young, uncertain heir. Charles, the man history would one day call Charles VII, but in this moment he was mocked with a far more painful name, the King of Bourges, a king without Paris, a king without authority, a king without belief, even in himself. England tightened its grip across the north. Burgundy, once a loyal partner of France, now played its own dangerous game, striking alliances that left Charles surrounded by enemies and betrayed by blood. Villages burned, markets emptied. Hunger became a constant companion across the countryside. Mothers whispered prayers over their children each night, unsure if dawn would bring safety or the English flag marching over the horizon. Paris, the beating heart of the kingdom, lay firmly under English control, and with the capital gone, something even more devastating vanished: hope. For decades, the French people had seen nothing but humiliation, defeat, and the slow erosion of everything they once believed unbreakable. The Valois name felt like an echo. The fleur-de-lis, once a proud emblem of kings, had become a memory smeared in mud and ash. And so Charles, timid and haunted, held court in Bourges, far from the great halls his ancestors had ruled. Every decision he made seemed overshadowed by doubt. Every messenger who arrived at his door brought darker news than the last. To many, it felt as if God himself had abandoned France. But history often chooses its turning points not in grand palaces or on glorious battlefields, but in moments when all light has gone out. And in this darkness, something unexpected was preparing to enter. If you want to follow this journey as it unfolds and support the series, remember to subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next chapter. They said nothing good could come from the forgotten edges of France, not from a village like Domremy, a place so small it barely appeared on any map. But history often chooses the quietest corners to ignite its loudest flames. Domremy lay on the frontier between chaos and survival. Armies marched through its fields, raiders burned its barns, families fled and returned only to find their homes looted once more. In this world of constant danger, a young girl grew up watching everything she loved tested by the war that had swallowed her country. Her name was Jeanne. She was the daughter of farmers, raised among cattle, fields, and the steady rhythm of village life. She did not read. She did not write. She possessed no noble blood, no military training, no political influence. But what she lacked in worldly power, she carried in a fierce inner certainty that no hardship could break. Even as a child, she had an unusual stillness, a way of listening, as if the world around her held deeper meaning than the chaos it displayed. As Domremy suffered, Jeanne saw how fear marked every face around her. Yet instead of surrendering to hopelessness, she began to sense a calling she could not ignore. She spoke of moments when she felt surrounded by a presence that seemed to lift the weight of despair from her shoulders. She described hearing a voice urging her to rise, to act, to protect. It was not a command of pride or ambition. It was something purer, something she believed came from beyond any earthly authority. She did not tell many at first. Who would listen to a young girl claiming a mission as impossible as saving France? Hers was a time when even seasoned generals avoided bold promises. But Jeanne felt the message growing stronger with each passing season. The war had reached a point where no strategy seemed to work. No leader could inspire. and no victory felt within reach. And in the middle of this national paralysis, she carried a conviction that bordered on the impossible. One day, she finally revealed her truth. She told her family that she had been chosen to carry out a task unlike any other. She said France could still be saved, that the kingdom had not reached its final hour. Most astonishing of all, she claimed she was meant to guide Charles to the ancient city of Reims, where French kings were crowned, to restore legitimacy, to restore belief, to restore the spirit that war had nearly extinguished. Her father feared for her. Neighbors whispered. Some called it madness. Others wondered if the desperation of the times had created this bold certainty in her heart. But Jeanne did not retreat. She stepped forward into her purpose with a clarity that no doubt could shake. In a world ruled by knights and kings, it would soon be a teenage girl from nowhere who dared to challenge destiny. Charles VII sat in the dim glow of the Dauphin's chamber, a young man whose crown existed only in theory and whose confidence had eroded long before a coronation could ever test it. He was clever, perhaps more so than his advisors admitted. But cleverness meant little when your own court doubted your legitimacy, and every whispered conversation felt like a plot to replace you. The war had drained him. France was a fractured shadow of itself, and he, the supposed future king, often felt like an imposter wandering through ruins. The arrival of the girl caused hardly a ripple at first. A peasant from the countryside requesting an audience sounded like either a joke or a nuisance. The court treated her as both. They mocked her clothes, her accent, her insistence that she had come with a divine message. But Jeanne did not flinch. She stood in the gilded hall as though it were a barn in Domremy, grounded in a certainty no silk robe or jeweled sword could provide. When Charles finally agreed to meet her, he did so out of curiosity more than belief. He watched her from behind a group of courtiers, waiting for her to falter. Instead, Jeanne walked past every man in the room and stopped in front of him, though he had deliberately disguised himself among the crowd. She bowed her head with a quiet reverence, addressing him as if there had never been any doubt about who the true Dauphin was. That simple moment, small as it seemed, struck him harder than the roar of any battlefield. Jeanne believed in him with a clarity he had never managed to find within himself. Their conversation was brief at first, careful, like two people testing the temperature of a river before crossing it. But Jeanne spoke with a calm intensity that unsettled him in ways he could not explain. She talked about France not as a lost cause, but as a wounded homeland waiting to rise. She spoke of Reims as if she could already see him crowned within its sacred walls. And most unsettling of all, she described his fears as though she had walked alongside him long before they ever met. For the first time in years, Charles VII felt something shift. Not confidence yet, not courage, but the faint outline of hope. Jeanne embodied everything he lacked: certainty, purpose, a belief that destiny did not belong solely to the powerful. Her presence was a challenge and a lifeline all at once. The court continued to laugh behind her back, but their whispers no longer reached Charles with the same sting. He watched the girl from Domremy with growing curiosity, wondering how someone so small in stature could carry so heavy a conviction. He wondered, too, whether he had been wrong about himself all along. Jeanne's arrival had introduced a dangerous idea. Perhaps France could still be saved, and perhaps its future king was not as weak as he had feared. They gathered her in a stone chamber where sunlight barely touched the floor, a room designed to unsettle even the strongest minds. Jeanne stood alone before a semicircle of priests, scholars, and noblemen who believed they had already solved her. To them, she was either a deluded child, a puppet of hidden forces, or a dangerous spark that could set the fragile court aflame. But they needed to test her. They needed to decide whether she was a blessing or a threat. The interrogation began softly, with questions meant to confuse her, to twist her words into contradictions. She answered calmly, without the polished language of the court, but with a clarity that startled her examiners. When they pressed her about her visions, she did not embellish or hesitate. She spoke of the voices with a simplicity that removed any hint of performance. It was not theatrics. It was conviction. Hours passed. They questioned her faith, her upbringing, her understanding of Scripture. They searched for cracks in her belief, but found none. And as the days stretched on, something began to shift in the minds of those who listened. Jeanne was untrained, but she possessed a sharp intuition that allowed her to navigate even the most complex theological traps. They tried to provoke her, to lure her into pride or anger. Instead, she remained grounded, as if anchored to something beyond their reach. Outside the chamber, Charles VII waited for reports. He expected the girl to crumble under the weight of scrutiny. Most adults did. Yet every message delivered to him carried a hesitant respect, a reluctant acknowledgement that Jeanne was not what they expected. The clergy found no trace of heresy. The nobles found no sign of manipulation. The scholars found no ignorance they could exploit. Her strength was not in argument or education, but in a kind of unwavering sincerity that could not be coached or faked. When they examined her physical presence, hoping to uncover some irregularity that might discredit her, they were forced to conclude the same thing. She was exactly who she claimed to be, a peasant girl with nothing but faith to offer. And somehow, that was more disarming than any political scheme. As Jeanne walked out of the chamber after the final interrogation, she should have appeared weakened. Instead, she looked steadier than when she entered, as if the trials had burned away any remaining doubt. The whispers that followed her were no longer mocking. They were watchful, uncertain, tinged with something resembling awe. Charles VII observed her from the far end of the hall, noting the quiet determination in her steps. He realized then that his decision could no longer rest on strategic caution alone. France was collapsing. Orléans was circling the edge of defeat. The army was exhausted, its leaders hesitant. And here was a girl who seemed untouched by fear or cynicism. Giving her command would be a gamble, but doing nothing would guarantee France's ruin. So Charles made a choice. He gave her a banner, a small force, and a chance to march toward a city the kingdom was already preparing to mourn. Jeanne accepted without triumph, without hesitation. To her, it was simply the path she had always been meant to walk. The fire that France had long thought extinguished was beginning to stir. Jeanne stood motionless as the smiths fastened each plate of armor around her. The metal shimmered in the dim torchlight, catching the eyes of soldiers who had forgotten what courage looked like. When she received the white banner, she held it not as a weapon, but as a promise. Its fabric rippled softly, as if answering a call only she could hear. The march toward Orléans began through villages hollowed by years of war. Charred rooftops, abandoned fields, and weary faces followed their path. The soldiers moved like men carrying ghosts. Yet when Jeanne rode among them, a shift stirred. Her presence was not loud, but it was unmistakable. People stepped out of their doorways to watch her pass. Mothers whispered blessings. Children stared at her banner as though it were a rising sun. At first, the commanders kept their distance, convinced she would crumble under the weight of battle. But as nights fell and fires were lit, they found themselves listening. Jeanne spoke simply, without rhetoric or pretense. She reminded the soldiers of the land they defended, of the breath of France that still lingered beneath ruin. Her voice wrapped around their fatigue and gave it shape, turning despair into determination. Slowly, unity returned to the ranks. Captains who once argued over authority now exchanged quiet nods. Jeanne did not command through power. She commanded through conviction. The way she rode at dawn, the way she lifted her banner against the wind, made even the proudest officers feel the sting of their own doubt. When the distant thunder of cannon fire echoed across the horizon, Jeanne leaned forward, urging her horse ahead. The men followed instinctively, not by order, but by the pull of something they had nearly forgotten: hope. And as Orléans neared, that hope began to roar. The first real test came at the gates of Orléans. English fortifications ringed the city like iron claws, and for months the people inside had lived with the taste of fear. When Jeanne arrived, she did not wait for doubt to settle. She rode straight to the ramparts, her banner rising above the sound of cannon fire, and the French soldiers surged forward as if her courage had ignited something buried deep within them. The assaults that followed were not reckless bursts of emotion, but bold, calculated strikes that caught the English off guard. Jeanne moved through the chaos like a force shaped by conviction. Arrows snapped against her armor, smoke coiled around her, and yet she pressed on, urging the men to hold their ground and push where the enemy least expected. Even when she was wounded, she refused to withdraw. Her return to the front, pale but unbowed, shattered the fear that had haunted the army for years. Within days, the impossible happened. The English lines broke. The siege that had strangled Orléans for nearly half a year collapsed under the weight of a belief the invaders could not understand. When the city gates opened and church bells erupted in celebration, the people called her the maid sent by heaven. Jeanne did not claim the title, but the soldiers embraced it, carrying it like a blessing into the next battles. Momentum began to sweep through the Loire Valley. At Jargeau, the French advanced with a confidence unseen in a generation. At Meung, they cut through strongholds that had once seemed untouchable. At Beaugency, victory came with such force that the commanders who once doubted Jeanne now looked to her before every decision. Each triumph carved away the despair that had weighed on France since the dark days of Poitiers. For Charles VII, these victories shifted more than military fortune. Jeanne had done what no general could. She restored belief in his destiny. As reports of liberated towns flooded the court, the hesitant king felt the ground beneath him change. The path to Reims, long thought impossible, now glimmered with possibility. Jeanne saw it too. In every village freed from English rule, in every cheer that rose from the people, she sensed the stirring of something greater than battles or banners. France was waking, and the tide that once dragged the kingdom toward ruin was beginning to pull it toward rebirth. The road to Reims stretched before them like a promise carved into the land. Town after town opened its gates to Charles VII, not out of fear, but with tears, songs, and a relief that trembled through entire communities. Jeanne rode beside the royal procession, her banner bright against the summer sky, and for the first time in decades, France felt as if it were breathing again. No longer cornered, no longer broken. Something long lost was returning. Inside Reims Cathedral, the air was thick with incense and awe. Charles knelt before the altar, unsure for a moment if he truly belonged there. Then he looked to Jeanne. She did not speak, But the conviction in her eyes answered every doubt that had ever plagued him. When the archbishop placed the sacred oil on the young king and the crown settled upon his head, the cathedral erupted. Bells roared across the city. Soldiers cheered until their voices cracked. And through it all, Jeanne stood quietly, gripping her banner as if holding the thread that had pulled a dying nation back from the edge. But coronations do not silence enemies. They only shift the battlefield. Even as the celebrations swept through Reims, shadows gathered beyond the horizon. England saw the coronation not as a defeat, but as a challenge to crush. Burgundy, humiliated by the tide turning, whispered plans of vengeance. Letters were sent in the dark. Alliances hardened like steel. The same forces that had once strangled France were preparing to strike again, this time with colder precision. Jeanne sensed it. The triumph at Reims was only a breath between storms. Her victories had reshaped the war, but they had also placed a target on her back. Some nobles feared her growing influence. Others whispered that no peasant girl should stand so close to the throne. The very court she had saved began to splinter with jealousy and suspicion. Yet Jeanne did not retreat. She urged Charles to continue the campaign, to press the advantage before the enemies of France could recover. Her vision was clear, her purpose unchanged. But the king, newly crowned and hesitant once more, wavered. The delay opened cracks. Into those cracks, betrayal began to seep. As Jeanne prepared for new battles, forces she could not see were already setting a trap that would change her fate forever. The light she had brought back to France was real, but so was the darkness waiting to swallow it. And as this chapter closes, her banner still flies, but the wind has begun to shift. If you want to follow the rise and fall of this extraordinary journey, the courage, the sacrifice, and the shadow that will soon claim the Maid, make sure you follow and subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next.